The Bible has no shortage of parts that are very unsettling. Now, some of these are peripheral to the overall Christian worldview. There are obscure snippets that report some strange or disturbing things that people did with no indication of what God spoke in response. The book of Judges, for example, has a number of these. Many other parts are unsettling, largely because of the differences between us and the people who lived back then, our different social or cultural norms, our moral stances, or our particular understanding of the cosmos. But neither of these is the case for what we'll explore this episode. God commanding Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac as a burnt offering. A father's love for his child is something that is the same regardless of culture or time, whether today or 4,000 years ago. This is even emphasized in the story as God speaks to Abraham with these words, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, and offer him as a burnt offering." And this is a pivotal story in the Bible. It's not some story tucked in some obscure corner. It essentially completes Abraham's story and his journey with God so that what comes after in his life feels more like an epilogue. But why? Why would God ask of this of Abraham, this horrific thing? And one answer is perhaps the most unsettling part of the story. It's because this is what everyone who follows in Abraham's footsteps, everyone who encounters God, who speaks with them, will eventually hear. We will all eventually be confronted with the same call. Take the one whom you love the most and give them over to God. Welcome to What Do You Mean God Speaks, where we explore important ideas, insights, and stories in Christianity for the skeptics who want to understand religion, to the Christians who have questions about their own beliefs, and everyone in between. I am Paul Sung-Woo-Jung, and this is our 9th episode of the 3rd season, Why God Asked Abraham to Offer Up His Son. We are all Abraham laying Isaac down. Here's a question. At what point do you think you will become so sure that God is with you that you would feel secure about everything in your life, no matter what happens? If you believe in God, that is, or arrived at that belief at some point in your life. We can even retrace the journey that we've taken so far in this series. So you've learned that what we mean by God is not simply some invisible, super powerful entity that seems nowhere to be found in our modern and scientific world. Rather, God is reality that is all around you, all of reality, encompassing every real thing and every possibility. And let's say you've come to think that reality is more like a speech than an inert mass of things because the entire cosmos is formed and shaped by principles and laws, and because reality does unfold sort of like an infinite story as if it is spoken by some author. Let's also say that you're moved by how truthfulness, justice, and compassion enable us to flourish together, and that love of ourselves, of each other, and the world around us is what makes life beautiful, and that is a fundamental character of our reality somehow. So, say you've concluded from all of this that reality seems to be more of a who than a what, a who that speaks forth all things, laws, principles, history, goodness, beauty, and everything else, a who that perhaps even personally speaks with us. Suppose you took that idea and actually tried it out. You've begun to relate to reality as who by listening to see if something does speak to you. Perhaps you went on some kind of pilgrimage or a meditative retreat. Or maybe you went to a church service or a gathering. Or perhaps you simply prayed. Let's say that something did speak to you in a meaningful way. Maybe you had one of those religious experiences like a vision or a dream. Or perhaps it was more like a sense of calling or inspiration or an inner voice speaking. All of that can be God speaking to you, since the only definitive trait of God speaking to you is truth. After all, to ask whether God is speaking to you is the same thing as asking, are you hearing from that which speaks forth everything that is real? And say you followed what was spoken to you, whether it was a call to change the way you live your life, or to uphold some moral conviction, or to strive for an ideal, or to change the world, or perhaps something simple like taking care of your family or friends. And suppose that when you did so, your life unfolded in a way that confirmed the truth of what you heard. It really was the voice of God. Maybe what you heard were things that you've known already, and you just needed to be reminded of them. Or maybe your life unfolded in remarkable ways as you followed that voice, enabling you to overcome adversities that you never would have faced, or learn things that you never would have grasped otherwise. Perhaps your family was rescued from a crisis, or you were transformed as a person, or perhaps your community or the world became a better place. Or maybe the voice that spoke to you spoke of things that you could not imagine was possible, something you could not believe even as it was spoken to you. But what the voice spoke really did happen, and you realized that you are hearing from the living God. You witnessed what you can only call a miracle. Reality unfolded things that everyone thought was impossible, things that you have long given up, things that everyone gave up on after years and years of trying and hoping. And now they suddenly came to life and bore fruit. That is how it was with Sarah when she gave birth to a son long past her childbearing age, just as God spoke to her and Abraham. So if all of that happened, what would you think? Would you be convinced, for example, that you should relate to reality that is all around you as a who and not a what? Would you become convinced that the one that unfolds everything that happens is God, who also personally speaks with you? And I would imagine the answer is yes. However, would that make you feel secure about everything, no matter what? Because remember, that is a question that I asked earlier in this episode. If you are sure that God personally speaks with you and is present in your life, would you feel secure? If you are convinced that God that speaks forth all of reality is speaking with you and guiding you, would you feel safe? Would you be at peace? Well, not necessarily. Because life is full of uncertainties, which is to say, we do not know what God will speak forth into our life in the future. God speaks forth the light, but also commands darkness. God brings sunshine and the rain, but also droughts and floods. All of this is part of life. All of this is what God can speak forth, and that makes us afraid. We are afraid of what reality may unfold. We are afraid of what God may speak. Life is full of trouble, even after miracles. Because unlike children's fairy tales, our life on earth never simply ends with living happily ever after. For Abraham, it happened a few years after Isaac, the miracle child, was born. When Isaac is weaned from his mother, Abraham holds a great celebration. But during the festivities, Sarah sees Ishmael, now in his pre-teens, playing with her son Isaac. Now the Hebrew word here is rather ambiguous. It could mean mock or play around. So it may be that Sarah saw Ishmael harassing and mocking her son Isaac. But the word could just also mean harmless horsing around. Whatever it was, this sets her off. She goes to her husband Abraham and demands that Hagar and her son Ishmael is sent away and removed as a member of their household. Now this sounds rather harsh, and it is. But for that society, the brothers Ishmael and Isaac presented a very complicated and potentially dangerous legal conundrum. The problem was simple. Who's the heir? Well, Isaac was. He is born of Abraham's proper wife and is the legal heir, whereas Ishmael is the son of a slave woman. But Ishmael is also the firstborn son of Abraham, and this is not simply an issue of who inherits which parts of Abraham's estate. You can split the things that you own to your children, but Abraham is the head of a household and the leader of a community of people. So the question is, who will be the next head? Who will continue Abraham's legacy? That's much, much harder to split. And even worse, Ishmael is older, and it is likely that Ishmael would gain the support of the group before Isaac can come of age and proves himself. Simply put, if Ishmael continues to hold some claim to Abraham's inheritance along with Isaac, he would be in a position to oust Isaac from his rightful place. It is unclear from the story alone whether Sarah was fully aware of this danger, though I would expect so, but either way, Genesis reports that Abraham became very distressed because of this. After all, Ishmael is, before anything else, his son, not some threat to Isaac's future leadership, but first and foremost, a son that he loves. Then God speaks to Abraham, "Do not be distressed because of the boy and your slave woman, and do what Sarah tells you." Then God promises Abraham, "I will make your son Ishmael into a great nation." God will bless and care for Ishmael and Hagar as Abraham's family. But what God promised specifically to Abraham will continue with Isaac, not Ishmael. In other words, God was saying that it is Isaac who will continue Abraham's journey with God because it was Isaac who was born from God's impossible promise to him. Ishmael will walk his own path with God. Indeed, numerous people throughout the ages across the world had their own encounter and walk with God and leave their mark in history, and Ishmael will be one of them. But Ishmael's journey will not be Abraham's, nor will it be a direct continuation of it. So Abraham gives Hagar and her son a supply of food and water and sends them away. Technically speaking, they were freed from their bondage, but in their social context, that was actually equivalent to being laid off from your job and evicted from your rental housing. Hagar and Ishmael then wander the wilderness both figuratively and literally until their supply of water runs out. Hagar lays her exhausted son down under a shade of a bush and sits down some distance away from him, about a bowshot's length, the story specifies. Then she weeps because his child is about to die of thirst. "Don't let me see my child die." Then God speaks through an angel. "Don't be distressed, Hagar. I have heard the voice of this child even where he is. Lift him up, because I will make him into a great nation." And as Hagar looks up, she sees a well of water. This was, according to Genesis, God opening her eyes to see what was really there before her. She hurriedly brings water to her son and has him drink, and from there they regain their strength, and Ishmael grows up in the wilderness. Genesis reports that God was with him, so that he grew to be a renowned archer. Hagar found a wife for him in her own homeland, Egypt, and Ishmael eventually became a leader of his own band of people. But even now, I don't really understand why Abraham didn't send his own son away with, well, more things, livestock, money, whatever, at least enough for him to get set up. I mean, I do understand why, thematically and narratively, Hagar and Ishmael are heroes of their own story that God has called them to, encountering God who speaks forth their lives and to face their adversities and hardship, and God enables them to build a life and legacy of their own without any support or help from Abraham. So in terms of the message that the story seeks to convey, I understand. And it may be that this kind of answer is the only definite kind of answer that Genesis will provide us. If you remember the second episode of this season, the account of the lives of Abraham and his family that we read in Genesis was written primarily to inspire people to follow in their path and continue their journey with God. It is not simply a description of things that happened in the past. It is not, for example, a log or a journal. It is meant to be about the lives of real people, yes, but the specific details of their lives and what happened were adapted and composed in order to raise a very particular set of questions. What does it mean to relate to God that speaks with you, walks with you, and guides you? Where does that journey lead you? What sorts of things will you experience, and what kind of adversities will you face? What struggles will confront you, and how will this change you? What kind of character will be forged in you through all of this? These questions are what the biblical accounts address, and what his stories are trying to answer. So the reason why Hagar and Ishmael were sent away with only a supply of food and water? Because that's what it's like when we are cast out into the world with only God going before us. That is how Genesis would answer such a question, because that is the message that Genesis is trying to impart to us. And it is likewise with what happens next when God speaks to Abraham to offer Isaac as a burnt offering. It is trying to impart something regarding our relationship with God that speaks with us. After these events, God calls to Abraham. Abraham. Here I am, Abraham said. God speaks, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on a mountain that I will show you. This is how Genesis opens a story that is commonly called the binding of Isaac, or in Hebrew, the Yaketa. And there is something deeply perplexing about God's call to Abraham to offer up his son. And it isn't just that it is such a cruel command, or that Abraham obeys the call to essentially kill his own son. Firstly, human sacrifice is utterly taboo in the Bible. God forbids human sacrifice as abhorrent and abominable. There is even a passage in the prophetic book of Jeremiah where God speaks out against the people of Judah, a nation descended from Abraham, because they sacrificed their children to God. That was something that I did not command, God declares, and it never crossed my mind. Except that God did command exactly that to Abraham. So, what's going on? Now, some people may rather thoughtlessly chalk this up to another example of the many inconsistencies of religious belief. But remember that those who put together the book of Genesis, at least the version that we are reading today, would have been well aware of this taboo. So why didn't they just omit this story? And this is why there's a prominent view in the Jewish religious tradition that God was not commanding a human sacrifice, and Abraham knew this. The wording is very specific. Not slaughter your son as a sacrifice, but present him to God as an offering. But then, why go through with all of this, with wood and fire and knife and everything? There is clearly something more, and that's probably why there still is a live debate in Judaism regarding this to this day. Secondly, God promised that Abraham would have descendants so numerous that they would form a nation, and that this promise was regarding Isaac, born through a miracle, and not Ishmael. But if Isaac is sacrificed and killed, the promise would not be fulfilled. So what God commands Abraham goes directly against what God spoke and promised. God is contradicting himself, and it makes the promise a lie. And again, the primary and absolute character of God speaking to us is truth. This issue is brought up explicitly in the New Testament portion of the Christian Bible, in the letter to the Hebrews. This letter, which is in the form of a written sermon, points out that Abraham was called to offer his son even though God had promised him that his descendants would come from Isaac. And this is one of the reasons why, for example, in Islam, the view that the son that Abraham was asked to offer was Ishmael rather than Isaac became prominent. Because after all, Isaac is a child of promise and therefore cannot be killed. Yet again, this would have been an obvious point for those who put together the book of Genesis, but still the story of binding, the Yaketa, confronts us today. So even though God abhors child sacrifice, even though God spoke forth an unbreakable promise that Abraham's descendants would come from Isaac, and unfolded a miracle in fact, having Sarah give birth to him long past their childbearing age, God still calls to Abraham, take your son Isaac and offer him as a burnt offering on a mountain that I will show you. Why? Because there is a kind of cold war that humanity has been waging against God since the opening chapters of Genesis. Remember that episode in the second season, Why Did Humanity Fall by Eating from a Tree? Humanity eats from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. However, this was not about gaining knowledge, nor about morality. It was about knowing what can happen in our lives, the good and the bad, and Adam and Eve ate the fruit of this knowledge because they came to distrust God. They listened to the accusation from the serpent that God was secretly their enemy. And there is a particular kind of knowledge that you gain from learning to distrust others. It is knowledge of what might be the case, even if it turns out that it actually isn't the case. Your friend might betray you, even if they never actually do so. It is a knowledge that brings fear and poison and paralyzes you. Humanity is marked by this fear, this distrustful fear of God that speaks forth all things. We are afraid because what God speaks forth, what can happen in our lives, hold an infinite sea of possibilities, some of which terrify us. The problem is, not everything is about us and what we want. Another episode in the second season, the one on the Genesis creation account titled, What is the Purpose of It All?, explored our tendency to think that everything exists for our sake. But Genesis actually implies that God spoke forth each thing into being for their own sake. God speaks forth the light and darkness, the cycle of time, so that things can happen. God speaks forth the sun, moon, and the stars to move across the heavens in orderly manner and shine. God speaks forth life so that it can grow, multiply, and fill the world. And that is what they are and what they do, whether we want it to or not. So time flows even when there's a looming deadline that we can't make. The sun rises even when we want to sleep in. And weeds grow and multiply, filling our garden to our utter dismay. Yes, according to Genesis, God created humanity with the capability to gain mastery over the world around us and so forge a life worth living in this world. But we still do so only within what God speaks. We may defy gravity in a way by flying on a plane or rocketing ourselves to the moon, but we are still following the laws of physics that God is speaking. Our mastery of the world that Genesis describes is paradoxically about learning with humility, learning what is real and true, seeking what is good, and realizing our place in this world. We live in a world that God speaks, a world that is not just about us and will not yield to our whims. Simply put, we cannot bend God to our will, and we cannot gain mastery over God. And that terrifies us because we, just as Adam and Eve, have ingested the knowledge that comes from distrust. We are suspicious of God, fearing that God may be our enemy, that God is hostile, and that makes us vulnerable, at the mercy of what God may speak. And there is at least something to our fears, because depending on what we do and how we build our world, God responds differently so that we can flourish together, but we can also perish together. So a kind of cold war has been waged between humanity and God, except that it is entirely one-sided, like fish plotting against the ocean even as they swim in it, or the planets rising up against the laws of gravity while orbiting the sun. And Abraham is a child of Adam, and he also has plenty to fear. He has already lost one son, Ishmael, at least in the sense that he now lives a life separate from his father. What of Isaac then? What can happen to him? Well, he may become gravely ill. He may have a horrific fall while playing outside. A wild animal like a lion or a bear can attack him. Raiders can strike him down or carry him off. Perhaps he will be unable to have children. What if something like that happens? What if that is what God unfolds in his life tomorrow? Now, the story itself in Genesis does not say this is what Abraham feared. It does not tell us what he was thinking or feeling. But it does not have to. Remember, this story is still part of Genesis. The account of Abraham's life is a continuation of what happened when Adam and Eve ate the fruit from the garden, recounted in the earlier chapters from the same book. Abraham is part of the Cold War because all of humanity is. Yet it goes beyond just the common fears of a doting parent over their child. Isaac is the promised child. God promised Abraham that his descendants will come from him. If something were to happen to Isaac, Abraham wouldn't just lose his son, he would lose his God. And it would be especially terrible because God brought about a miracle by enabling Sarah to give birth to Isaac in her old age. So if something were to happen to Isaac, it wouldn't be because the voice that spoke to him was powerless and so somehow failed to fulfill the promise. It would instead mean that God would have betrayed him. But Abraham trusts God. He had journeyed for a long time, following this voice that spoke forth everything in his life, and so far, God was with him and fulfilled everything that he promised. So Abraham had faith in God, and God spoke with him as a friend. But that's today. What about tomorrow? What if Abraham missed something? After all, God did bring a drought to this land before, forcing him to flee to Egypt. Yes, his wife was saved from the ruler of Egypt, but the drought did happen. God did strike down the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Yes, for their cruelty and tyranny, but still it does mean that God brings down cities and people. And God did instruct him to send his older son Ishmael away. Yes, he had his own destiny, and Abraham's journey was to continue with Isaac, but the bottom line is, Ishmael was taken away from him. So on the one hand, fears confront Abraham because he is a child of Adam. On the other hand, he would remember what God has done in his life, what God has spoken forth and fulfilled. And so Abraham would have been, as we are, suspended between faith and distrust. And so, God calls Abraham. In all the other times in his life, God simply spoke to Abraham. In previous times, Abraham was simply presented with a truth that God speaks. But this time, God calls and waits until Abraham responds, and then speaks. There is a faint echo here of that moment in Genesis when, after eating from the tree, Adam and Eve hears God and goes into hiding so that God has to call out to them, "Where are you?" And so God speaks, "Abraham?" And Abraham responds, "Here I am. I want you to take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and bring him to a mountain that I will show you. There, offer him as a burnt offering." The term burnt offering has a very specific meaning in the Bible. Other kinds of offering that is described in the Bible leaves something for you. You burn up certain organs and fats of the animal, but you get to keep some of the meat and eat it with your family and your community. With burnt offering, you burn everything, which signifies that it is given over completely to God. That is what God is calling Abraham to do, give his son over completely. To step forward from where he hangs, suspended between terrified paralysis and hopeful faith. Bring his son and present him as an offering, and consciously and deliberately face the very real possibility that God may take him away completely and utterly, leaving him with nothing. Abraham takes his son, Isaac, on a 3-day journey. Then he sees a mountain from which God is calling him. "Father," Isaac speaks up, "here I am, my son. We have the wood and the fire, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham responds, "God himself will provide the lamb for the offering, my son." I used to think that this was just Abraham lying to his son because he just couldn't bear to tell him the truth, but I no longer think so. If he just wanted to lie, he could have said other things like someone will meet us there with the animal or something. And much more importantly, how this story ends suggests strongly that Abraham believed, or at least hoped, that this was what God would do, that Abraham would present Isaac as an offering, but God would instead take a lamb that he would provide for himself. We tend to think that this story is simply about God testing Abraham, but it is also about Abraham betting on God. Abraham is confronting his vulnerability. God may take away Isaac from him despite the promise. God may speak forth things in his life that will reveal that God was deceiving him all along. The poison of Adam's fruit burns him. So he lays Isaac down, resolving to believe that God will not break his promise, that God will not betray him no matter what happens. This is about faith, about what holds together Abraham's relationship with God. But how far can that go? What will make suspicion and distrust finally overwhelm his faith and corrode his hope? What if Isaac becomes ill? What if he's injured? What if he's mauled by an animal? What if Isaac dies? Would that mean that God betrayed Abraham? The story of the binding of Isaac is not simply about Abraham willing to give whatever that God asks of him. The background of God's call is that there are things that can happen that will reveal what God speaks as a lie. There are things that we fear that God will speak forth, which will reveal that God is really our enemy, and that his promise is a sham. God must preserve Isaac's life. God must uphold his promise. But Isaac is vulnerable to things that can happen in life, and so Abraham's relationship with God and everyone else who follows in his path are likewise vulnerable. And Abraham must, by his own choice, bring himself to that crossroad where he must confront his fear that God may, in the end, betray him. Because until he does so, he will always remain frozen by that fear. And on the top of the mountain, Abraham binds his son and lays him down on the pile of wood. What will God do? Abraham still hopes that God himself will provide a lamb. What if he has to go through with all of this, though, and has to kill Isaac? Yet, that question was something that he has been asking all along in a different way, long before God called him to offer Isaac as an offering. What if Isaac dies, even if not by this knife, but by an illness or accident or wild animal or raider or anything else? Here the letter to the Hebrews in the New Testament writes, Abraham had faith that God can even raise dead people back to life. And so, according to Hebrews, God's call to Abraham to offer his son was really about faith. What will make Abraham secure and at peace that God is with him? God unfolding miracles after miracles would not bring him peace because that is yesterday and today. What about tomorrow? What will bring him peace is courage. Courage that comes from faith. Courage to believe that God will not betray him. Abraham must, once and for all, step past his fear to lay down the very life of his son, as well as all his faith and hope in God, and see for himself what God will do in response. Abraham takes out his knife and raises it. Suddenly something calls to him. The voice of God speaking through an angel. Abraham. Here I am, Abraham answers. Don't lay a hand on your child, God speaks. And just as Abraham spoke to his son Isaac, there is a ram caught in a thicket before him by its horns. Abraham offers a ram as the burnt offering and names the place the Lord will provide. And God speaks through the angel. You have not withheld from me your son, your only son. So now I know that you fear God. The word fear that the angel says here is not the kind of fear that humanity has for God after their fall. That fear is a terror of being betrayed, born of distrust and suspicion, rooted in our ignorance of God. The word in Hebrew, rather, denotes a kind of fearful respect that comes from being deeply engaged with something and knowing it profoundly. It is the fear that old sailors have of the sea, which they regard as their true home, as they gaze into its horizons, reading its waves and the storms. It is the fear that old mountaineers have of the mountains that they love, their knowledge of their beautiful crags and peaks, the cold and the ice. Abraham knows God. He knows what it means to approach God. He knows God will never betray him, and he has staked everything, his own son, on that faith. And so God declares, because of this, I will bless you, and your descendants will indeed be as numerous as the stars, and all the peoples of the world will be blessed because of your offspring. There is a tribal people called the S3E9 living in Western New Guinea, Indonesia. It is reported that in their culture, those that can deceive their enemies through cunning and trickery are regarded as great heroes. This in itself is not too unique. Even in the West, we have the figure of Odysseus, the Greek hero, who defeats his enemies by trickery and strategy. But this does make it very difficult for the S3E9 to make peace when they are at war with each other. After all, because trickery and betrayal is so respected, you can never be sure that an offer of peace is not a lie. According to the Christian missionary who lived with them, the S3E9 therefore had a sacred practice, the peace child. The leaders of the warring tribes would offer their own son to the enemy tribe to be raised among them. Their sons would become vulnerable to their betrayal. And when they present their son to their enemies, they must have faith that no S3E9 will ever hurt their child, will ever deceive or betray the peace child, because he is their sole and unbreakable promise of peace. Humanity has been waging a one-sided cold war on God. God then calls a man to offer his own son to him, a peace child, and when that man, Abraham, offers his son, he finds that God is not at war with him. God never was at war with him. And so Abraham finally reaches his peace with God. But that is not quite the end of the matter. For according to Christianity, Abraham offering his son as a peace child was but a foreshadowing of God offering his own son, the one who will live among humanity, speaking everything that God is speaking to them. But this peace child would be betrayed. So please join me next time as we continue to journey toward that still distant time when God offers his peace child as the generation of Abraham and Sarah passes over to that of their son Isaac. And please continue to support this series by following, subscribing, and sharing this series with others, and by rating it on your Apple Podcast platform. You can also support this series at buymeacoffee.com. The link for that is in the episode description.